In this video, we will be discussing the changing times in the 19th century and how to tell the difference between the different decades of fashion. In the 1700s, we saw great opulence and ornamentation reflected in the fashion of that time. Later, the French Revolution would cause the changing and simplified dress styles of the 1780s to come to the forefront of mainstream style. The grand interest in classical antiquity began at the latter part of the 18th century. Such revivals appeared not only in fashion but in architecture, interiors, and various fine arts. Women desired to dress like those of their ancestors during this time period, and so they tried to emulate them. They constantly sought to reproduce the supposed fashions of Rome and ancient Greece. Garments were mostly made of fine cotton muslin. This fabric achieved a lightweight drape upon the body that could not be accomplished by wool or of silk. The waist was extraordinarily high, directly under the bust. This waist, of course, is known as the empire waist, and it comes directly from this time period. The dresses also often featured long trains, which were common both for day wear and evening wear. But by 1807, we see that these trains begin to gradually disappear. In addition, the silhouette of the 1800s compared to the 1810s is a little wider and not as slim as the 1810s. Dresses were also often white in color because it was thought at the time that ancient Greek and Roman women only wore white dresses. Here are a few takeaways from these 1800s garments. Firstly, they are floor length. They have an empire waist. There is typically a train. There are only slight details on the bodice, but nothing too extraordinary. There is often no ornamentation that interrupts the bodice, but there is only a cohesion of the pattern altogether. And the signature dress of the day would have been a white cotton muslin gown. During the 1810s, we see that the vertical emphasis of the silhouette still remains in fashion. However, more ornamentation and detail covers the dresses during this time, and the dress's silhouette comes closer to the body. There is more use of color and less exaggeration on the white Grecian gown. Textiles also became more diverse during this decade, where firmer cottons and silks were the norm compared to the fine draping muslin of the previous decade. Hairstyles also continued to show classical influence, but now they were pretty much primarily parted down the center. Now here are the takeaways from the 1810s. We see little fluidity in the dresses compared to the 1800s. We see the same empire waist. We see increased ornamentation on the dresses. There is more use of color and more use of various firmer textiles. The 1820s were defined as a transitional period, where we see the last remnants of the neoclassical and empire style and silhouettes, and instead the influences became a new romantic movement. The 1820s were a time that emphasized imagination, femininity, individualism, and emotion. The silhouette of the day underwent critical and important changes during this time, but in the first portion of the decade, the style was very similar to the 1810s. We see the waistline below the bust and a skirt that is slightly flared out. Sleeves were also puffed at the shoulder. Year by year, the waistline dramatically fell into the natural level by 1825. But as the waistline dropped, the skirts and sleeves began to get bigger and bigger. Three-dimensional trim and decoration was very popular along the hem of the dress. Hemlines also were shortened above the floor and were padded with cotton or wool to create a trapezoidal frame. Sleeves, as they grew, began to be elaborately decorated as well. The dresses often borrowed elements from the past several hundred years, ranging from the medieval period through to the 18th century, and the Renaissance era was particularly favored. Now let's talk about the key takeaways from the 1820s. We know this time to be a transitional period where the hemline is lifted above the ground, the skirts are a little wider. We see that the waistline has dropped to about the natural waist. We see the decoration and ornamentation of the garments to be overly exaggerated and increasing during this time, and the largeness and puffiness of the sleeves begin to grow. The 1830s was defined by exuberant and dramatic dressing. There was an influence not only in Romanticism, but also in interpretations of the 17th century. The wide collars, puffed sleeves, and curled hairstyles were in vogue. In the early 1830s, the silhouette consisted of a nipped-in waist that fell just above the natural waistline. There was extraordinarily wide sleeves and skirts that ended just above the ankle. There was high levels of ornamentation and extreme exuberance within the whole garment. Everything was over the top and very extreme. But in the latter portion of the decade, when Queen Victoria was crowned and throned in 1837, the fashionable woman was no longer one of great excess, but of mild and modest form. The buoyant fashions of the early 1830s quickly collapsed, and the large sleeves fell from the top of the shoulder and throughout to the bottom of the arm. The key takeaways from this period are exuberance, excess, and tons of ornamentation. Sleeves are the largest during the 1830s, and the waist is quite nipped in just above the natural waistline. The period is also marked by romantic motifs and motifs from the 17th century styles. The 1840s marked the last years of the Romantic era. Now, a Gothic revival had emerged, where demure, understated style was in fashion. There was also a great emphasis on modesty, and during this time period, women covered more skin than in previous decades. The silhouette of this time period consisted of a long-waisted bodice and tight, narrow sleeves. The skirt also happened to be full, skimming the floor, and was of a dome shape. Bodices overall in the 1840s featured a V-shape effect, which emphasized the long, small waist and narrow sloped shoulders. The neckline was commonly found in the V form during the daytime. But the day were typically comprised of the entire body being covered up except for the neck and head. Collars were very common during the day and added an extra level of ornamentation, while still being modest. Bonnets, when going out, were also very much in vogue. One could also accompany their ensemble with a shawl, both for evening wear and for day wear. Evening dresses often featured a bare neck and bare arms except for small sleeves. Now let us discuss the key takeaways and elements from the 1840s. We see the end of the Romantic period and a shift to demure modesty instead. There is a general lack of ornamentation and a lack of trim amongst the bottom of the dress. There was a gathering at the waist in a V form, and shoulders sloped dramatically. Day wear also often featured the whole entire body all covered up except for the neck and head. And the skirt is of medium fullness, not as small as the decade prior, but not as large as the decade later.